Good afternoon. So I'm Blake, and there are three things you should know about me to understand a little bit where I'm coming from. I am from North Carolina. I am a geographer and GIS person, and I think constantly about gerrymandering. Also want to point out that this is a US-centric talk, definitely in the US context, so I apologize to all the international attendees. But as I think about gerrymandering all the time and think about visualizations of it, it's a slightly hard thing because no less than the Washington Post has already released what they proclaim to be the best explanation of gerrymandering you will ever see. So there's a high bar, but I actually want to look at this gerrymandering and use this sort of as a device to explore some things that I think this explanation does not cover that are important parts of the story. And I'll keep moving. So for folks who haven't seen this, I'll run through it very quickly. You can see that we have 50 people, or that can be 50 precincts, and depending on how those are carved up, you get three different outcomes. It's a 60-40 split in terms of the political makeup, but you can see you get the different outcomes, including one where the 40% group ends up on top. I think this does three things well. One, it points out the fact that the very same voters, you can have different outcomes depending on how the lines are drawn. It talks about packing and cracking, which is the classic gerrymandering strategy that's specifically on the far right. And it talks about how there are different things to be weighed, like whether it's compact or not. But I'm going to tweak this a little bit, just turn it sideways 90 degrees so it fits better on the screen. Change the colors. This is one thing that I think that explanation gets wrong, is it focuses on it suggests that the red is always the person who's doing the bad, the nefarious activity. But in fact, Arnold Schwarzenegger had great success fighting gerrymandering in California, where it was being done by Democrats. And currently there's a case in Maryland that's going before the Supreme Court, again, gerrymandering done by the blue folks. So we're going to use different color scheme. I also want to point out that in some cases you have dispersion. So there are some places where you're not, the voters are not segregated by their groups. So I've used the example of Oklahoma in the past, where it's about 60-40, but you can't really carve out the blue voters to do something the way that they show in the Washington Post piece. Actually, interestingly, there are 5 districts in Oklahoma. One of them went blue in this most recent election, so maybe Connecticut would be a better example, but I don't have a slide for that. So again, returning to this is the basic idea of the classic gerrymander, and you see again the serpentine ones at the bottom, where you've got 9 circles and 1 diamond. But they don't have to be serpentine. So you can actually, this is the exact same outcome. You'll see the 2 districts that border the bottom also are a 9-1, and then you have the diamonds prevail in the others. And these are much more compact. They actually have a more compact perimeter than the so-called perfect representation in the Post piece. This is an example. North Carolina's current congressional plan is considered one of the most gerrymandered ones in the country, but they don't look terrible. These don't look all that nefarious, but they are currently, these will also be going before the Supreme Court. Some people would say that it's important to have competitiveness, that rather the perfect representation isn't necessarily that you get a 60-40 outcome, but you have an outcome that has some play in it. So these don't look that pretty, but they would actually provide 3 districts that are 5-5. So here you actually could have multiple outcomes. So that's one thing that in Arizona, for example, it's actually baked into their commission that does the line drawing, that you actually have to maximize competitiveness. So that's another ideal that people strive towards. One thing that Post piece doesn't talk about is race. This is huge. More redistricting plans have been overturned on the basis of race than on partisan gerrymandering. So in the case of Miami, I put the tilde here for an Enya. What if this was a predominantly Spanish language group, the ones that are highlighted here? How would you draw the district around those? This is a major point in how the Voting Rights Act is enforced, is how these districts get drawn for minority communities. This is actually a district outside of Chicago that has been upheld because it was drawn to connect 2 Latinx communities that had an African American community in between them. So this is often shown as an example of a bad gerrymander, whereas that was actually done to satisfy the Voting Rights Act. What if you have constraints like a municipal boundary or a river? There are things called communities of interest or affinity areas. How do you take those into account? In this case, the ones that I've labeled, imagine these are incumbents. This is a huge part of when consultants draw the districts. Again, the politicians are the ones who are drawing the districts. Do you think about where the politicians actually live? That's hugely important. B and C would not want to be in the same district running against each other, and A wouldn't want to be in that gerrymandered district because that person would surely lose. There's an example from North Carolina, one of many, by the way, where you can see that the politician's residence is right at the very edge, and almost half the congressional districts look something like that. And, of course, people don't divide neatly into bands, but we're familiar now with what's called accidental gerrymandering, where folks are concentrated, typically one group in the urban areas and another group in the outskirts. So it might make sense to draw the scheme that looks something more like this, maybe like Colorado. And, of course, we know it's not binary. We're not all diamonds and circles, so these symbols are meant to be somewhere between a diamond and a circle, and, of course, a spectrum of colors, and it makes it more complicated. But that's the picture we're living in. And something that also I will touch on very briefly, there's something called prison gerrymandering, where you can inflate the numbers with people who actually won't vote. There's gerrymandering done around where the wealthy donors are located. People want to have wealthy donors in their districts, factories where they can go and do a photo op, opportunities for pork like a university. And there are stories, you can see Mom over on the right, where people have actually drawn districts so that their relatives will be in the district, family members. This is just an effort to lump it all together to show some complication. All the things that have to be considered. It's not simply just grouping the similar colors together. This is an example from Sam Wang at Princeton, and I think this shows well the having to balance various concerns. I don't think anyone would say either of these options is gerrymandered. They both are defensible in terms of how they distribute the area. Some might think it makes sense to have the cluster in the center having its own district. And others might think that maybe every district should represent some folks from that city center, but the outcomes are quite different, whether it's 5-1 in favor of green or 4-2 in favor of purple. And I have some other examples of things that I have done, but I think in the interest of time, we need to keep moving. So I will just skip over those, and folks can contact me afterwards if they want to look at some of the work that I've done. Thank you so much.